Do not store your books like this. This is never, ever a good system. But here's what was read this year. As in, everything here to there. Oh, he looks bad today. So, it's been several months since I last made anything due to just work in university, and also nobody cares because nobody watches these, but they're quite fun. I have fun doing them. But pretty successful year of reading. I meant to do 70 books, didn't manage it. I think I've managed 60, which is still pretty good. Currently reading 3 books off the top of my head. I'm reading Little, which is over here. Wonderful-ish. Try and review it when I finally finish it. Another book on Napoleon, and I have a book that I found in a park about the basics of Christianity. So fun so far. But I'm going to do my top 10 best that I've read. So quick disclaimer: these aren't books that were released in 2021. I don't read a lot of contemporary work. I try to, but it's really, if it dawns to me at the moment, like I did finish Shadow of the Gods, which as a contemporary novel has really been pushed by a lot of people who do booktube, and I was surprised how good it was. So yeah, none of these were released this year, but they're just the 10 best things I've read this year. I also have honourable mentions. I guess I can get them out of the way now actually, which would be Pride of the Orange Tree, really good up until basically the end, and some niggly little narrative things in it. Shadow of the Gods, also really, really good. I do have it, but it's in my spare. There wasn't actually too many things that were just off about it, it just didn't quite reach to that highest level that it could have. John Gwynne I've never read before, but I do look forward to reading more of him. I have some more honourable mentions down here. Liza Lockmora. I know this is like this is actually, I'm sorry, I have fish and they're incredibly aggressive. Liza Lockmora is like a bit of a booktube classic. It's really bumped up, and usually I don't put much stock in that, but this is actually brilliant. To the point where I was so charmed by everything in it. Goodreads goes into it in more depth. Really surprised how much I like that. And I've also got Regeneration by Pat Barker. I had to read this years and years ago for university when I was studying literature and medicine, and there's some books when you're having to read them really grab you and some don't. This didn't grab me at the time, but I reread it and it's actually a wonderful and heartbreaking story. So good, can't recommend enough. And I think I've got one more. Yep, there it is. So this just missed out. I'm a huge comic book reader. Hate the comic films, but I love the books. And this is like my very, very snazzy copy of the best Daredevil story, Daredevil Born Again, by Frank Miller and Mazzucchelli, who also worked together on Batman Year One, which is kind of the definitive Batman story. Not in my eyes, but it's one of the greatest ones, no argument. But it's just not quite as good as the one that I've read this year. But Daredevil Born Again is what gets cribbed a lot whenever they try and adapt Daredevil. First in the shitty movie, and now in the shitty TV series, well, Netflix series, although it's coming back I suppose. There will be parts of it, but Born Again, nobody has really touched on the possibilities of Daredevil, who could well be the best comic book character ever written than Frank Miller did in this, and it's just a shame that he's never really topped that 80s run he had with Daredevil, Batman Year One, and I guess Dark Knight Returns, which I also reread, but on reread it's not quite as good as its reputation holds up. So with that, my top 10 is not going to be in order, as in order of quality, because anyone that watches the Goodreads will know I often will call something the greatest book of all time, which is a definitive title, and about 6 books have got it at that point. So these are just going to be in alphabetical order. Some of them I don't own, but I do have. I've read them just from the library, and the first one will be Jojo's Bizarre Adventure, Steel Ball Run, which is part 7 of Jojo's. I love Jojo so much. This is the best one. The first 2, I would say, aren't quite my kind of thing. 3's okay, 4's really good, 5's brilliant, 6 is brilliant, 7 is the best thing. Steel Ball Run is so good that it's not even my dog. That it should be like examined. So one of the problems with JoJo's in particular, but all manga really, is unlike Western comics, they haven't quite got the trade paperbacks. They call them tankobons, which are brilliant. It's just a collection, but because there's so much of manga, like the volumes are massive, it is hard to collect them all. So JoJo's in its entirety would be massive. Like Steel Ball Run alone would probably be about that big. Absolutely worth it. I would buy that. I've owned Doorstop books in the past. I owned From Hell, don't know where the fuck it is, but that's a Doorstop book. Art Spiegelman's work on 9/11 is actually this incredible book that I need to find, because nobody has discussed 9/11 like Art Spiegelman did. And I've got a couple phone books of Cerebus by Dave Sim, well-known misogynist, but also kind of a genius comic book writer that may have lost his mind. But Steel Ball Run is just the best one. So I am reading like each volume individually, but I have read it as a oneer. And even though on my Goodreads I think the second volume I didn't rate as high as the first, that has nothing to do with the actual quality of the story, because as a whole, if all of JoJo's was collected, it would be an absolute 5 stars. It's a masterpiece. It's basically a reboot of the entire JoJo series, so we go right back to the start with Jonathan Joestar, who in this has been recontextualized as a jockey who was handicapped, and the second protagonist would be Gyro Zeppeli, which I think he is easily the favourite of the JoJo's characters. He alone is basically the protagonist of Steel Ball Run. He's the most fascinating one. The things he does is just brilliant. He's incredibly funny. He's outlandish. It's also where Araki's art style is perfected. He has this really beautiful way of just showing how dynamic the character movements are, and everybody is a fashion model. One of my favourite things about JoJo is, particularly after part 4, is how he focused on fashion and more life and character designs. He's got this really beautiful queer masculinity about JoJo's, where you wouldn't ask questions like, well, why would someone wear that? You would ask, why wouldn't you wear something like that? Why wouldn't you wear flamboyant purple leather and like like shaded sunglasses back in the 1800s, or just stars everywhere, or in the case of this version's Diego, he's got his name on top of his hat. It's just beautiful. Everything in Steel Ball Run is close to perfect. The stand battles are brilliant. There's a dynamic sense of pace. Its main plot is just wonderful. It's got one of the best villains also, and it's just a really good time. All of JoJo's is fun to read, even though I think if you were to do them monthly, they would be torturous. I haven't kept with JoJolian just because I couldn't wait. It's the same reason I don't do monthlies of comics. I couldn't keep up with it every month. It would be too much for me. So, first one, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Steel Ball Run, an absolute must read. Second, absolute masterpiece of the year, is non-fiction. Michael Broer's Napoleon Volume 2, Spirit of the Age. I am a massive fan of anything Napoleon related, and Broer's is, I don't know, it's not been released at this moment in time whether there'll be a Volume 3. I feel there will be, but his volumes on Napoleon this and Soldier of Destiny are the greatest biographies on Napoleon that you could get. This one is discussing basically the years of 1805 to 1810, and that includes the Grand Army. And it catalogues his time in Austerlitz. It also discusses the divorce of Josephine, and it really just goes into the minutiae of what was in Napoleon's private life and also his family life. There's really like sad passages of this where Napoleon really loves his brothers, but his brothers keep continuing to let him down, and they can't ever live up to the basic magnificence of Napoleon. Like, he expected such a high standard from everyone around him that he was either let down or he was very jubilant. There's great parts in this where it discusses his relationship with Jean Lannes, who, in my opinion, if Lannes had survived, he would have replaced Napoleon as that figurehead. An incredible general, one of the greatest marshals of the Napoleonic era. Just a wonderful story of like the revolution lifting someone up, and it's just incredible. There's so much you can just gush about this, and scholars of Napoleon have discussed the book at length. It just goes into such a beautiful detail about one of the, if not the most impressive man who's ever lived. It is up there with the podcast of the Age of Napoleon, which is also a wonderful thing to supplement what isn't in this, and vice versa. Absolute triumph. I can't wait for if there is a third volume. I really hope there is. I had the opportunity to see a signed copy of this 2 years ago, and I didn't do it because it's a book on Napoleon. I'll reread it multiple times and it'll get dog-eared and destroyed, and the signed copies were just in hardback. But can't recommend it enough. My first non-fiction. Okay, and the third book, but my second non-fiction, is by John Carreyrou, and it's Bad Blood: Secrets and Lies in Silicon Valley Startup. This chronicles basically the massive scam that was Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes. And I think his name is Sunny Balwani. I could be saying it wrong. I probably am saying it wrong. But incredible. If you are skewing slightly more left and you're a bit more skeptical of anything that comes out of Silicon Valley, really, or any startups in general, John Carreyrou's Bad Blood is a great place to get started. He's also just a wonderful journalist to read up on when you can. This basically just chronicles how Theranos was this massive scam. It was up there with the Juicero, it's up there with Tesla, it's up there with every cryptocurrency, and it's wonderful. It's really, really incredible, just the reality distortion field that Elizabeth Holmes managed to put around herself, and John went into incredible amounts of detail. His work was constantly being criticised, and the Theranos lawyers were constantly on his case, but he didn't give up, and he continued with it, and really kind of blew this massive scam wide open. And it's just a wonderful thing to see. Like, hopefully she will be convicted. In fact, everyone involved in this should be convicted. Everyone on the board. He goes into great depth, by the way, of who made up the board of this. And even though I don't want to agree with him, Bill Gates is correct that it's not surprising Hollywood's turning this into a movie. It sounds fictional, what happens in it. It's ridiculously insane. But unfortunately, the more you read about Silicon Valley and startup and basically tech and app culture, the more this doesn't seem that different. I could see John Carreyrou writing something like this about Tesla in a few years' time. No downsides to this. Wonderfully researched. If you're going to be pedantic, the fact that it won a award from McKinsey is a little bit of a negative. If you want more information about how dodgy McKinsey are, just look up a Chapo episode, really. incredible book. Also, I think check. Yes, my last non-fiction. I don't have my fourth one, which is Dashiell Hammett's Red Harvest. Red Harvest, I go into a better description on the Goodreads review as usual, which is where I thrive really. Red Harvest is on loan right now, but it's possibly the best noir just ever written. In many ways, it's also the template of it, but its influence actually goes a lot further than that, because Red Harvest directly influenced Akira Kurosawa for The Seven Samurai, which then obviously was like turned into The Magnificent Seven, which was then copied by a whole lot of other films, and then including Leone's work, and the entire landscape of cinema can kind of be traced back to The Seven Samurai being such an incredible work that just had to be aped, and the fact that it was originally this noir novel really contextualizes everything. It's the first in the Continental Op series, which is brilliant. The Continental Op would be thought of now as like the stereotypical hard-boiled PI, but he's not. He's quite schlubby. He's not fun to be around. He's cruel. He's unattractive. He's everything that the stereotypes of noir aren't, and he's just a great character to follow. It also has like a lot of just brilliant, sharp, biting noir parts to it. Like the setting is in a place called Personville, but in the story it's called Poisonville, which is wonderful. There's gangsters, there's bootleggers, there's femme fatales, there's a lot of fights, there's a hell of a lot of drinking. It's just kind of got everything you need, and even though it's all po-faced, it's very, very serious, it's so enjoyable to be around that the cliches of it aren't cliche. You feel them as closer to like trademarks or something comfortable to find, and that's wonderful to find, especially in an old book. This hair is just off today, and I can't fix it. That's the worst part. I'm gonna keep it in because it's really late and I'm going out in 45 minutes. But yeah, everything about Red Harvest is just so good. I wish I had my copy with me, but I've lent it to someone who in turn lent me The Face on the Cutting Room Floor, which is kind of a response to Red Harvest because it's more of a meta commentary on noir, which is fun. I did like it, but it just wasn't quite up to Red Harvest's standard. I'm still thinking of Bad Blood. I would check out Red Harvest immediately, just for a good time and also like a good track of noir, because I think it's actually due to come back at some point. So on to my fifth one, which is a start of like not an apologetic tone, but a definitely hasn't done himself any favours recently. It is the greatest Spider-Man story ever. Spider-Man Blue, in this gorgeous hardcover edition which I got back when I was a teenager. Incredible work. So it's by Jeff Loeb, but like all comics, fairly you should mention the artist, especially when it's Superior and Tim Sale. They've actually worked together on a lot of projects. They worked on Daredevil Yellow, Hulk Grey, and another great Batman comic I read this year, which is a slight tangent, but whenever people do films about Batman, they kind of stay with the same ones. It's always Dark Knight Returns, Batman Year One, Long Halloween, Killing Joke. Long Halloween is the one that's less known of those, but is, I would say, about equal with Year One. And they worked together on it. They're very into like gangsters and old time. There's a lot of great parts in Long Halloween which are just direct rip-offs of The Godfather, which is a lot of fun. But nobody has made a better Spider-Man than Spider-Man Blue. Spider-Man Blue is an absolute heartbreaker of a story. It doesn't really want to focus on Spider-Man much at all. It focuses a lot more on Peter Parker and his just tragic love with Gwen Stacy. But there's so much restraint in Spider-Man Blue, which is really impressive, because one of the problems I have with people revisiting Gwen Stacy is they want to focus most of all on her death, and Spider-Man Blue doesn't do that. It actually focuses on her life and how wonderful she was for Peter, how different she was. It's also got some beautiful artwork in it. How different she was to what he'd experienced. It also gave him a sense of confidence being around Gwen, that he wanted to be better for her, and she liked him exactly how he was. It's also got one of the best framing devices in this, and I'm not really spoiling anything with it, where Peter it's Valentine's Day and he's feeling blue, so that's the colour explained, and he's recording kind of a love letter to her on his Uncle Ben's, which is even more tragic, old tape recorder, which he has used for Aunt May. And he basically just recounts how he met her, and that's it. And it's heart. The last page is heartbreaking. I know that the No Way Home has been out for a little while at this point, and it's kind of everything I hate about live action Spider-Man. But mostly because they'll never reach the maturity that's in Spider-Man Blue. Especially the last two panels are just, they sum up everything great about Spider-Man. And it's, the only downsides to these are the stuff I usually really love, which is a lot of the supplemental material at the back is like interviews with Salem Loeb about like ideas for the series, concept designs, and like fan art, just stuff like that. Usually I love these, they're really, really good to get to know the artist and the writer a bit better. But Loeb is just such a piece of shit in this, and he's so parodic of a nerd that he is. And Sale is really the one that's saving it, because he's got just the better concept work, and he's also the much better interviewee. He gives much more mature answers, and also Loeb's fairly recent scandal involving just immaturity, I would say, sets it back a little bit. It's a real shame that like great works of art sometimes made like absolute pieces of shit. But yeah, wonderful. This is the story that they should make. Whenever you hear about people arguing for more maturity in MCU and stuff like that, what they really mean is like violence. This is the kind of thing that's more mature. It's heartfelt, and it's not afraid to just be a bit normal, and also to be sincere. There's a real sincerity to this work that MCU doesn't have, and it's a shame. It's the best one. And we've got here number 6, the greatest book ever written. My tattered, beaten to hell version of Blood Meridian. Blood Meridian, the greatest book ever written. It's this epic of just absolute evil and destruction. It's just nihilism. It's complete nihilism. There's no hope in Blood Meridian, other than maybe 1 or 2 chapters. But the framing is so good. It's this nameless protagonist called just the Kid, which I guess kind of like a archetype of like Western fiction. And he joins up with real life scalp hunters led by John Joel Glanton, who moved very quickly on from butchering Native Americans to just killing innocent Mexican and innocent Native tribes and just selling their scalps. He became wanted in Mexico and the US. And this is a fictionalized chronicle of it, but it bases on some real world accounts. I think it's by Samuel Beckett, maybe? I'm not 100% sure. I could be getting the name wrong. I think so, but it references like obviously real people that existed. John Joe Glenn did exist. There are accounts of Judge Holden, who is, and Harold Bloom's correct, the most terrifying figure in all of Western fiction. The judge is more a symbol of the changing times and the application of violence into every situation, because even though the judge is a seeming expert on almost all fields put towards him, he propagates violence first and foremost, and that is his solution to everything. He gives these long, beautiful, but terrifying descriptions of war and how it's fun and that it's the real nature of man. And from the actions in it, he's never wrong, which is incredibly unfortunate. And there are parts of this which have been criticised for overwrought violence, and I can understand why. But the book, I don't think, is meant to be read as glorifying it. Every single part of it is just, it's sad. Reading it is just sad, because you want these people to be making better decisions, and any humanity that the kid has, he continually fails himself over and over and over again, and the judge is there to just play on that. Toadfine is just there to always fail him, and Glanton is just there to show that there is reward for this behaviour, and it's just grim. Like, all of McCarthy's work is nihilistic. I don't think he's ever written something which doesn't have like an undercurrent of just hopelessness. And even though this is apocalyptic, and it really, really is, it is a masterpiece of writing. There's nothing better than this in Western canon, really. This is kind of the novel that he should have won the Nobel for, but didn't. It's also just, if you like the written word, which sounds really lame, but if you like literature, it's hard to not enjoy picking this up, and it's also not something that I have trouble recommending to people. It's so brilliant that I don't have to put a caveat on it. It's just wonderful. There's nothing better than this. It's terrifying, but it is a must read. Another comic, kind of the most famous one, by Mr. Alan Moore, and it's Watchmen. Also, I'd be remiss to not mention that Dave Gibbons did the incredible art in this. Everyone knows Watchmen. Hopefully everyone knows Watchmen from actually reading it, and not the shitty movie. But Watchmen's kind of hard to get into unless you're talking to someone about it, because a review of it would spoil it fully, because you kind of have to really get into the layers of how wonderful it is. I love Watchmen a lot, that I have a supplemental book by Gibbons discussing all of the references and all of the historical parts of it. So, just offhand, which backs up Moore's belief in magic, there's like a smiley face on Mars that is connected to like Gideon's Lock. Well, Gideon's Knot, sorry, which is then referenced in the story by Ozymandias with background art. And Moore, being Moore, would believe that there's some occult reason why all this is together. But basically, Watchmen is the end point of comics as far as superhero goes. Written in the 80s during Thatcher and Reagan, but Moore has bumped up to an alternative history where Nixon has had numerous terms, just roll over and roll over. Cold War is still going on. US imperialism has still ranked up. They won the war in Vietnam, which has had disastrous consequences. And it's a world where superheroes exist, but these aren't superpowered. There's only one person in this with superpowers, and his existence is a crisis. Everyone that meets Dr. Manhattan has an existential crisis. The idea of a Superman would be terrifying, and Moore leans into it. He says, yes, that's 100% true. And everyone else that is a superhero, or as they're called more often, like a costume hero or a costume vigilante, is shown to be profoundly broken. And each one was kind of based on a figure already there. I believe he originally wanted to use... what's their name? There are like analogues to like the big DC characters, but he wanted to use like lesser known ones. Like off the top of my head, the comedian was based on Peacemaker. Charleston Comics was that, and this was when Moore still had a really good working relationship with DC. Kind of fell apart. One of the reasons was just royalties, differing political opinions, and also there were some issues with like Twilight, the superheroes, which the concept of it sounds brilliant, and it's just a shame. Like this is kind of his hurrah for DC and Vertigo, really, and not Vertigo, sorry, Titan. God, it's difficult to get into. It's just such a wonderful alternative world. There has been like pushback. This is also one of the books which people have pushed back upon, saying that it shows like a misogynistic bent to Moore, and if that's people's like experience of it, like I can't tell them they're wrong, but I can point out like there's more nuance. Obviously, like you shouldn't insist on people getting the nuance for them, but it is there. I saw one review which stated that like every woman in this is like raped or sexually assaulted. It's not true. They are referencing something that is horrific in it, but Moore clearly points to this being horrific, and then later on, and in a way I could see people being very upset by, subverts it by making it more complicated. Now, I might not agree with him on the complication, but the character does, and you're meant to be reading them for the character. Now obviously someone's real beliefs come in there, but based on everything else Moore reads, I don't see misogyny there, particularly his work with the other greatest comic of all time, The Ballad of Halo Jones, and the greatest collection of comics, which is Promethea. But that's like not a slight tangent, it's a pretty big tangent, but wonderful. If you like books about like broken people, the failure of heroism, and the failure of capitalism, you will want to pick up Watchmen, because it discusses all these things. It is also the best argument to use when you're arguing about the shitty movie. Whenever someone loves that movie, just tell them to read the book, and they will get a completely different outlook. One of the problems is, for example, Rorschach. Rorschach is obviously like this iconic character, and there's something about him that resonated with it, but it's that they didn't get that Moore didn't like him. He's not meant to be the hero. He's not the hero. He's a victim. Everyone in this book is a victim, and that's kind of the genius of it. Still incredibly important today. Some downsides to it. There isn't really any. He even does experimental stuff in it where the culture of this alternative world wouldn't have superhero comics, so their comics are very pirate based, which is a lot of fun, and he breaks up the issues with little supplemental material, either from like newspapers in World or essays in World. Absolute genius. Nothing is as good as Watchmen. Certainly comics have never reached the maturity of Watchmen. I knocked over the camera. So the 8th one is Toni Morrison's Beloved. Not my original copy. My original copy I lent to someone, but an ex of mine left her books with me, and this is her copy. Thanks, Alexandra. I love this copy. I really love Vintage, the publisher Vintage, and this is a different edition than what I have. I had a lot of the red spine Vintage, and this isn't, but it's a beautiful copy, and I'm really happy she left it with me. This one, Toni Morrison, the 1993 Nobel Prize, well deserved. I've read some Morrison before. I've read Tar Baby, and I've read this obviously, but I want to read more. I was going to read Jazz this year, but somebody took it from my library, so it might be one I have to buy. But I'm really looking forward to it, because Beloved's the greatest book ever written. It's post-slavery. Slavery has just ended, and we're nominally following Seth. Seth is an ex-slave who lives in this home that is apparently haunted, with her daughter Denver, and it's incredibly sad. It's about motherhood. It's about like the trauma of slavery. It's about just the experiences that they went through, and just the desperation that slaves existed with, and obviously shouldn't have. And it's also something that I remember last year reading about Henrietta Lacks, and I talked about it then about black women not owning their bodies, and Henrietta Lacks being an example of that. And Morrison touches on this a lot. Obviously, she is a black woman. This is a lot of experience, and she's getting through a lot of like generational trauma, and it's hard to not read Beloved and not feel like tremendous just sadness and pain at everything that's described, because it also focuses on just horror and like human beauty that's in it, like real leading connections. The more when you're reading this, you will quickly fall in love with her daughter Denver, who is just doing her best and really loves her mum, and just really wants the world to give her a chance. And you'll also feel like a real empathy for Seth, who has just got so much trauma and she's never going to go over it. And it actually ends on this incredibly like bittersweet point that it's heartbreaking. It's a wonderful book, incredibly well written, incredibly descriptive, and it just pours on more and more and more. It also doesn't hold anything back. There are descriptions of like sexual assault in this, regular assault, torture, but it's never done gratuitously, which I think a lot of books which are discussing atrocity can sometimes fall into. But Morrison is such a sensitive person and such a wonderful writer that she never leans into it. She really focuses on the important messages that have to come across in this, and I'm so happy that I started the year off reading Beloved. I had to read it for uni, and it's just one of the things that really hits you and you take time off afterwards. It's that affecting. Incredible book. Great, number 9, and another comic, and also one I spoke about at the start. The greatest Batman comic of all time. Batman Year 100. Lesser known than a lot of greatest Batman comics that you'll read about or hear about, but so underrated. This is the one that I really hope the new Batman films have a little bit more input to. This is like, it'll sound stupid, but this is like the most realistic Batman. You could become this Batman. His costume is a little off. His abilities are not quite superhuman, as he's often portrayed as being like perfect. The level of detail that Paul put into everything, because he's the writer and he's the artist for this, with I think colouring by he is Villarubia, which great colour. I need to just take a passage real quick. Here we go. Wonderful, vibrant colours. Pope's a little bit like a manga artist in the regards that he writes and draws his own work. This was 4 issues, I believe, and it's more of a discussion on Batman than like a straight story. Excuse me. It's set 100 years after his first appearance, in 2039, and it's in this police state Gotham. One of the things I love in any work of art, but particularly in comic books, because it's a medium that is immature, is when someone's actual politics come through. And Paul Pope is this massive raging libertarian, which I don't agree with, but I love how he takes his beliefs and he does transform it into really clever art, which is overreach on government control, an individual being correct and fighting against the power. Because Batman's at his best when he's fighting cops. That's one of my favourite things. And this one is a world without heroes, but unlike other ones where they come back, it's just Batman. Then there's not any like wild superpowers in it. It seems to have been a I don't want to use the word, but I can't think of anything better. It seems to be like a cleansing overnight, where the entire US government has just got rid of all the whimsy and the campness that was in the world that are superheroes, and it's completely run by like corporate teams. They have this brilliant concept in it where the police forces have like football jerseys on and they have like names. So there's like Gotham Panthers, the Gotham Wolves, and then there's the federal services too. It's just great. He's got all these little cool gadgets that would nowadays look a little weird, but it's so lived in. There's a lot of holograms, there's a lot of like strange, not occult, but like Eastern flavours in this, where Batman like meditates and he uses these words which there's no direct translation for. The Batmobile has been stripped back to just this bike. And there's also no clear resolution as to who Batman is, if he's Bruce Wayne or if he's not. And it's great. It's so good. Everyone should pick this up, and it's really something they should crib from a lot more than The Killing Joke, which they seem to do over and over and over again. Okay, and the 10th one, and the last novel I read, I think, possibly, is The Greatest Book of All Time, Blindness by Jose Saramago. Blindness is another book I picked up in university. Again, had to read it for literature and medicine. And it's just about the entire world going blind. And at the start, it reads as like this magical realist thing, because it's Portuguese. And then pretty quickly, actually, by about page 17, so second chapter, you figure out it's a horror. And then it just gets more horrifying the longer it goes on. Saramago is an incredible writer. I think this is what won him the Nobel also, so 2 Nobels, which is pretty cool. It just focuses on the absolute collapse of the world and society when everyone goes blind and everyone becomes needy. Protagonist in this basically is the one person left on Earth who has not went blind, and how she navigates this new world, and it's just horrible, the indignities that the world puts the first victims of the blindness through, and also the indignities they then do to themselves. There's descriptions of the body in this which get close to body horror. Saramago's work starts to discuss like the breaking down of the world and like the breaking down of dignity, which is a big thing, and also just the evil that people used to prey on each other. There's passages in the middle of this which are incredibly upsetting, but they aren't gratuitous. They are there for a good reason. And he, due to like his style of writing, I loved it in The Gospel of Jesus Christ, is very descriptive. He piles and piles and piles of description, and he also is almost like a suffocating writer. I'll give you a few examples of what I mean. There's not much in the way of breaking up of the paragraph. It is just reams and reams of never-ending prose, and it's all brilliant. It's so good. It's fairly timeless. It's placeless in many ways. I think it's clearly in Portugal, but he doesn't give any names, which is very useful for identification. And it's oddly a bit timey. Like, even though the real world pandemic hasn't reached blindness levels of barbarism, there was times where people were obviously scared and nothing was handled correctly. And blindness shows what could have been. There is absolutely no problems with it. I love everything about blindness. It is easily the greatest book ever written. Of all 6 of them, it more than earns its place. There's also like a real discussion of like a lot of love in this. Like, a lot of the characters, they do actions which you would think would be despicable, but the love like always redeems them in it, and that's quite a beautiful thing. It's one thing I love, is where people aren't scared of their sincerity, which I think I've read a lot of. There's a lot of sincerity here, unlike the worst books of the year, which will be the next video, and I will probably do it in the morning because I'm not about to go out. So thank you for dropping by. Hopefully I can get more. But obviously, working university will have to come first, and I'm going to try and hit 70 books again this year. Don't think I'll make it, but I'll give it a try. Thanks for watching.